two granddaughters, 18 and 19, that go to Ohio University. One's majoring in chemical engineering, so this is a topic that she can actually get involved in. But we've been fighting fracking around here for over a decade now, and when I see the stuff that's proposed in the blue hydrogen, I just think this is more, fracking coming our way.
Go ahead, Sean.
Anton? Yes, hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean O'Leary. I'm a senior researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute. And ORVI is a public policy think tank, a not-for-profit, and it is focused primarily on economic development issues in Northern Appalachia, the greater Ohio Valley region. And it just so happens that because energy industries, natural gas, coal, and otherwise are such large parts of the scene here, that we inevitably have to address those industries and their economic impacts on our region, and also hopefully explore alternative energy resources and how they can be transitioned to in a way that is both economically as well as environmentally sustainable.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Thank you to both our heavy hitters for being here. We're going to get rolling right into the presentation then. So a couple goals that we have here, a few, I should say. We're going to learn a little bit about hydrogen and carbon capture 101. We're going to learn about the harmful impact to human and environmental, learn about the status on the companies and projects proposed in Ohio to date. We're going to learn about why hydrogen is not good for the economy or jobs, and we're going to take action to prevent hydrogen hoax from hurting your community. Dr. Randy, go ahead, take it away.
Okay, so a little chemistry. This is the reason why they're choosing hydrogen, and they're claiming it's clean energy. And theoretically, with the reaction, it does only generate water vapor and energy when you burn hydrogen and oxygen. So unlike the top equation is what happens when you burn methane gas with oxygen, if you balance the equation, you actually get carbon dioxide and water molecules. So that's the simple, statement as far as, yes, it doesn't produce carbon dioxide, but there's so much more to it than just this. Next slide. Okay, so just a little background on hydrogen. I noticed on something on the Hydrogen Hub on the Arch2 website, this has been a while ago, and I was reading it, and they said, hydrogen isn't toxic. Well, no, it's technically it isn't toxic, but it's flammable and it's explosive. It's the #1 abundant element in the universe. It's extremely small. If you look at the bottom where the little hydrogen atom is, and you look at the bottom right-hand side, you see water has 2 hydrogens in it, and methane has 4 hydrogens in it. And this is basically where the Hydrogen Hub is going to get the hydrogen atoms from to make hydrogen gas. Diatomic gas is either from splitting a water molecule or taking them off of a methane molecule in the steam methane formation. The other thing about hydrogen is because it is so small, it can permeate a lot of different surfaces. It can go through plastic, and it can also go through steel and cause steel embrittlement. And years ago, and when I worked at National Steel, I ran a scanning electron microscope. And I can tell you that when we closed the microscope and we evacuated the bell jar where we actually had our samples, hydrogen would be able to go through the stainless steel bell jar that was tweaked down. It was torqued down with screws into a soft carbon gasket, but hydrogen could go through that. That's how small that molecule is. So I know from firsthand experience, it can permeate through fittings, like metal fittings. The other part of that slide shows you a little schematic of what it looks like for hydrogen embrittlement. And this is one of the reasons why you can't repurpose steel pipelines that they've used for methane gas. Eventually, you will have this hydrogen embrittlement, and that's a chemical engineering topic. I won't get into it, but I do know that it does cause issues with steel pipes. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are just some of the issues. I can't be all inclusive because it would take me too long. But one of the things, like the first bullet point, is that methane pipelines can only handle low hydrogen blends, and this is because of the embrittlement. So less than 20% before there's issues, with the hydrogen embrittlement, and it weakens the pipeline, and there could be explosions. And at that low percentage, those less than 20% blends only reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 6 to 7%. So you're really not getting much benefit when you blend 20% hydrogen with 80% methane. And then the second bullet point, blending as little as 5 to 20% into existing gas pipelines can lead to that unacceptable high risk of explosions in homes or urban areas where they do have the issue of the hydrogen embrittlement. The third bullet point, it can leak through walls of plastic pipes. The plastic pipes are porous enough and the molecule is small enough, 4 to 5 times faster than methane. And it can leak through the threads on mechanical joints of steel or iron pipes 3 times faster than methane. And this is what I experienced when I ran the scanning electron microscope. And then the fourth thing that they don't mention, because I know a lot of the projects have talked about using this for residential use and piping it into homes, is that our appliances are optimized for natural gas. If you have a gas stove or a gas furnace, so blending hydrogen above 5% and up to 20%, you're going to have some dangers there, because these appliances were not made to take that kind of a blend of hydrogen to methane gas. Okay, next slide. Okay, a lot of people have just glossed over this issue as far as hydrogen being a greenhouse gas. It's not a direct greenhouse gas like some of the other gases are, but it's an indirect greenhouse gas. And they've looked at it over a 100-year period where they've looked at 1 kilogram of hydrogen leads to as much global warming as 4.3 kilograms of CO2. And then the slide I'm going to show you in a minute points out how hydrogen, the chemical reactions that happen in the lower atmosphere with hydrogen and some of the other gases, these are what exacerbate the greenhouse gas issues with hydrogen. So it interacts with methane, ozone, and stratospheric water vapors, as well as aerosols. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I think the most important thing, right above the little H2, looks like a little arrow at the very bottom in the middle of that slide, you see a reaction. It says H2 plus OH gives you H and H2O. Okay, what happens in the atmosphere, and this is especially true with methane gases, we have things called free radicals, and the OH is a free radical. It's a hydroxyl radical, and it's kind of like a little detergent for the atmosphere. So it bumps up against other dangerous gases, and it removes them, or it reacts with them and takes them out of the atmosphere. So the one gas that's really important that it bumps up to, if you look to the left side of that slide where I have a number 1, is that OH radical bumps up against methane, and it takes methane out of the air. So if you don't have that OH radical free to do that, then that means the methane that the OH radical is taking out of the air on a daily basis is still present. What happens then, the OH radical reacts with the hydrogen and ties it up. So now you get an additional water molecule, which we all know the more water in the atmosphere, that's a greenhouse gas, the warmer it gets. And then you don't have that OH radical to react with the methane. Okay, some other things that it does without getting into a real deep chemistry lesson here is that it does increase, number 3, it does increase the amount of ozone. Now, ozone is great when it's up there in the troposphere. It's not so great when it's down here at ground level, because it causes things like smog. So that's another reaction. So those 3 are the important reactions, which shows you how hydrogen can act as an indirect greenhouse gas. Okay, next slide. Okay, I had on the very first slide or the second slide, the little dancing, hydrogen molecule and how they were connected, the hydrogen atoms are connected to water and they're also connected to methane. So the one of the dangerous things about this hub is it's going to promote fracking because they're going to rely on steam methane reforming to generate the hydrogen gas using the methane gas from fracking. Another way is the biogas. They're going to use anaerobic digestion. So what happens in your septic tank without oxygen, you can create methane gas in there. And then they're going to take the hydrogens off that methane to use. And then electrolysis, they'll split a water molecule using electrolyzers, and they will break that water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm not going to go into this real deep because I'm trying to keep an eye on my time, but this is just a schematic that shows what happens in steam methane reforming. And you can see, in the middle of the slide, it has hydrogen, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. These are all gases that are generated during that process. So yes, you do get hydrogen gas, but you get a lot of other gases as well. And in some cases, you even get nitrogen oxide gases. So it's not, a simple process because so much of that steam methane reforming around the world is used to make hydrogen gas and, generates enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. And that's where the carbon capture process of blue hydrogen comes into play. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is what the industry, when they talk about carbon capture and sequestration, this was a cute little cartoon. It's just really, is exactly what they think it does. It sucks all the CO2 off of the facility and then buries it underground. Like it's just as simple as that. And it's not nearly that simple. Next slide. So this shows you some of the things that are issues with carbon capture and sequestration. One of them is the fact that when they have this CO2, it's a supercritical fluid. So it's an extremely high pressure. It's like over 1000 PSI, just to give you an example. Like right now we're at 14 or 15 PSI. Your bike tires, when you inflate them, around 50 PSI. So imagine the pressure for over 1000 PSI, shooting that down into an area where we've already got, old conventional oil wells. We've got a longwall mining, we've got strip mining, we've got injection wells for brine from fracking. So you're shooting this very high pressure fluid down inside of these, cavities in the ground and crossing your fingers that it'll stay there. Another issue is the fact that if it does start to move through the bedrock, it will cause groundwater to be acidified. So you're making carbonic acid, and people that rely on groundwater, that's going to be an issue for them. And it also will, once the water's acidified, it can dissolve some toxic metals that are down there as well. And most of the CO2 now is used for enhanced oil recovery. So will we be using that for, oil and gas recovery here, or will we actually be using it to just send down into the ground? Okay, next slide. Okay, this is just a schematic that shows you the supercritical fluid. And I mentioned already, it's around the supercritical temperature is around 87 degrees Fahrenheit. So not real hot, but it's the pressure. I mean, the pressure is really high, over 1000 PSI. And you can imagine, when a pipeline is ruptured at that pressure, I mean, this just inundates the area. And so you've got CO2 everywhere. And it's not that CO2 is toxic, but and once there's CO2, there's no oxygen, and it will asphyxiate people. It will turn off combustion engines. You can't get emergency vehicles around. That city in Mississippi had this happen a couple of years ago. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is another form of hydrogen that they want to get. This is like your septic tank. You're going to generate methane from food waste or cellulose. I don't know where they're going to get the feedstock, but this is also energy intensive. And once you get the methane, then you're going to have to take the hydrogen off the methane molecule. So it's very energy intensive. And is this really worth the energy for the amount of hydrogen you get off the process? Okay, next slide. Okay, back in 2011, my husband and I, we live in Harrison County, just 3 miles from the Tuscarawas County line. We went to a meeting at Kent State's branch in New Philadelphia, and they were talking about this experimental injection well, and they drilled it. It's right outside of Junaid and Hutton, and that's where that got it circled with the little red star. That's where it was drilled, and they were doing it mainly as a test well. And any data that I got off the internet pretty much was inconclusive. So they couldn't say the bedrock was horrible for storage of CO2, and they couldn't say it was great. But regardless of whether it was good or not, the 3 counties right to the right of that star, Carroll, Harrison, and Tuscarawas, and we live in Harrison, those are the 3 counties that are being targeted for the carbon capture sequestration projects. Okay, next slide. Okay, to be truly green hydrogen, and there's a lot of data and different benchmarks that you have to meet to get certain classifications. But truly green hydrogen would come from using the electrical method to separate a water molecule, electrolysis. But the electricity to use for that process would have to come from wind turbines or solar energy. It would have to be renewable energy, and it's going to be very expensive. Green hydrogen is very expensive, and right now Ohio has about 4% of its electricity from renewables. So them saying that, you know, the plug power plants are going to be green hydrogen is not really true, because in order for it to be green, it has to be from renewable. And I'm betting they're going to pull that off of the grid, and it's going to be fossil fuel energy. Another issue with green hydrogen, regardless of whether it's renewable energy, is they use electrolyzers, and the fuel cells need PFAS, the forever chemical in the ionomers, and these are just you separate the oxygen from the hydrogen in the fuel cell. It's like a barrier, and it's very toxic. And right now, if you go online and just type in PFAS regulations and green energy or hydrogen, you'll see that in Europe and a lot of other countries are pushing back against PFAS regulations, because they basically are telling you know, the governments, we can't do this, we need PFAS, we can't make these fuel cells without PFAS, so we need excluded from these regulations. And the last bullet point, there are really no federal rules or regulations for transporting hydrogen via interstate pipelines. So nobody knows if FERC's going to handle it or MFAS is going to handle it. They don't have, you know, secure rules or regulations yet. So this is all, you know, going to have to be developed down the road, as well as trying to find out whether they can, or if they do, put in hydrogen pipelines along with the carbon capture pipelines. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just a schematic of a fuel cell, and I won't get into this real deep, but the right in the center of it, you see it says PEM membrane. That's a proton membrane where the electron can jump back and forth between the two, like a positive electrode, like you see in your car battery. And that center is where they need the PFAS coating. So it's impermeable, so the oxygen and the hydrogen can't get back together again. They're trying to, you know, separate the water and then keep the oxygen and hydrogen apart from each other. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is why we don't want us in our environment or anywhere, because it's such a dangerous chemical. It's very safe. The carbon fluorine bond is really hard to break. I mean, fluorine, if you remember chemistry class, it's the highest electronegativity of any element on the periodic table. So when it hooks up with something, it doesn't want to let go. And this is one of the reasons why the CFCs from the refrigerants were so bad for the environment and the ozone layer. They went up into the upper atmosphere, huge molecules with lots of fluorine and chlorine, very high electronegativities. And when they actually did break apart, and UV light helped that process, then they wanted to hook up to something. And what did they do? They clung to the ozone molecule and broke it apart and destroyed that ozone layer for many, many years, causing the holes above the planet and, you know, the escalation of cancer rates and things like that. But this molecule is stable and it lasts forever. And this is another reason why we really need to question using the electrolyzers and the fuel cells. We could use electric battery, you know, electric cars, rather than opting for something that's got these many issues with it as well. And I think that's my last slide. I hope I didn't get too chemistry oriented there.
Dr. Randy, thank you so much. I did want to just ask you one question before we move on in the chat. Somebody asked, what about H derived from splitting water molecule using solar?
You mean solar energy? What, yeah, that's what they'll do. I mean, they'll use solar energy to split the water molecule, but the actual process, you have to have an electrolyzer to do it. And that heat loss comes in because that's used in the membrane. Because once you split it, you got, it's like, you know, keeping two unruly kids apart. You got to keep the oxygen away from the hydrogen, because once they get together, they'll want to combust. You know, because hydrogen by itself, if it's totally encased, it's not combustible. But once it gets together with oxygen, any kind of ignition source, and it'll go up. I hope that explains it.
Thanks, Dr. Randy. We're going to hand it over to Sean O'Leary. Take it away. Sean, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Thank you for
That's okay.
calling me out. As many of you may have heard, the ARCH2 Hydrogen Hub is actually a consortium of a number of projects. Originally, when the Hydrogen Hub was conceived, there were 15 projects that made it up, and each of them had one or two development partners who would actually be building these facilities, some of which are hydrogen production facilities, and other facilities were there to be off-takers of hydrogen, users of hydrogen. And as we'll see in a moment, that cast of characters has changed somewhat. And that's because a number of projects have dropped out. And we'll talk about why, because one of the features that I wanted to emphasize to everyone who's here today is that ARCH2 isn't a done deal. I know that many of you have heard a great deal about the Hydrogen Hub, and I'm sure many of you have heard that ARCH2 has won $925 million in funding from the federal government to support its various projects. But, and this is a big but, that doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen or that it will happen on anything like the scale that the federal government is anticipating or that has been advertised. And that's because as big a number as that $925 million sounds like it is, it actually only represents about a tenth of the capital that is going to be required to actually develop all of the projects that have been talked about. The rest of the capital is going to have to come from commercial markets and investors. And we know that that's not necessarily going to happen. As I just mentioned a moment ago, there were originally 15 projects that were part of the ARCH2 Hydrogen Hub. 5 of those projects have now dropped out, and 4 of the development partners have dropped out of the hub. Now, ARCH2 announced today that they're going to go out and start trying to recruit replacements for those. But the mere fact that many are dropping out is telling us something about the hydrogen economy. And that is that a lot of prospective investors look at these proposed projects and decide they're just too risky. And I would remind everyone in the room that not long ago, we went through another episode like this. Many of you may remember going back about 5 or 6 years ago, we were then going to see the development of a new petrochemical cluster in the greater Ohio Valley. And there was talk at that time, heavily promoted by the Department of Energy, about the creation of a new plastics industry in the valley, which would be led by the creation or the construction of 5 world-class ethane cracker plants that would produce the raw materials necessary for the manufacture of plastic products. Well, if you hadn't noticed, we did not see the arrival of all of those cracker plants or the downstream manufacturing facilities. They simply failed to manifest precisely for the reason that I just mentioned a moment ago. When investors looked at the economics for those projects, they decided that they just weren't worth the risk that would be incurred. And so I just wanted to begin my little section of this by letting people know that just because we've heard so much about Arch 2 and just because it's getting hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding doesn't mean that the project as a whole or that many of its individual projects will actually come to fruition. And in that space between the expectations and the reality is an opportunity for folks like us who have concerns about what is being proposed to advocate to stop or modify many of the projects that may come as a result of this. Anton, if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a map that illustrates all of the Arch 2 Hydrogen Hub projects at the time the hub was announced. And you'll see that they extend from central Ohio on the west in Columbus to central Pennsylvania in the east, and from Lake Erie all the way down to the Kentucky-West Virginia border. Now, again, I said on the slide, it says 4 of the original projects have been dropped. It's now actually 5 have been dropped. And some of the remaining projects are also very susceptible to falling by the wayside because they're pursuing what are fundamentally uneconomic uses for hydrogen. And that means that it will be very hard for those projects to find capital investment. And the 2 that I'll point out very specifically in that regard are that you'll notice that is in the center of the map that you can see an area that's shaded in pink. That is the service area of a natural gas utility called Hope Gas. And so they provide natural gas to homes to power, heating and cooling and to power stoves and other appliances. One of the projects that's being considered under Arch 2 is to supplement the use of natural gas and potentially replace the use of natural gas with hydrogen, which probably makes people like Dr. Randy Pokladnik go nuts because that's a fairly dangerous proposition for a variety of reasons. But it also happens to be a very spectacularly uneconomic proposition. And the second application that's particularly uneconomic is the use of natural gas for generating electricity. And that's because we have much cheaper ways to generate not just electricity generally, but clean electricity with solar power, wind power, assisted by batteries and other technologies. So the challenge that we have going forward is, from an advocacy perspective, is that while a number of projects have gone by the wayside, Arch 2 is going to be recruiting new projects to add on. And so we're going to have to track these and follow these because it's possible that new projects could crop up almost anywhere. Anton, if we could go to the next slide.
Sure thing. Sean, I think the industry term for that is whack-a-mole.
Yep. Now, Randy talked about the chemistry of hydrogen and many of the environmental issues that it raises, both with respect to climate warming, but also with respect to health. Well, it turns out that even the benefits that we would ostensibly get from the development of the Arch 2 hub are pretty minimal. And I'm talking about both the economic and the environmental benefits. On the environmental side, the Department of Energy, in announcing Arch 2, explained that it would reduce carbon emissions by about 9 million metric tons annually. And again, we're talking about millions. It sounds like a very big number, but in fact, 9 million metric tons is less than about 2% of the carbon emissions that come out of Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania annually. And it's not even equivalent to the emissions that come from a single coal-fired power plant. I know there are a lot of people on this call who live, down around the area around Parkersburg, Marietta, and going up to Gallipolis along the Ohio River. And you're probably very familiar with the Gavin power plant there. The Gavin power plant by itself emits about 50% more carbon than the entire Arch2 hydrogen hub will ever abate. And to put it very bluntly, over time, the Arch2 hydrogen hub, between the DOE grant that has already been allocated and the subsidies available under the Inflation Reduction Act, could qualify for about $9 billion in funding. And all that I can say to you is it does not cost $9 billion or even $1 billion to close a coal-fired power plant. The other metric that is regularly cited by DOE is that the hydrogen hub will create 21,000 jobs. However, only 3,000 of those jobs are expected to be permanent. And of course, they'll be strewn out across 3 or 4 states if we include Kentucky in this. And when you think of that as a share of the number of jobs in the 3 states, which number over 12 million, 3,000 jobs is not even a rounding error. It's not enough to materially affect the economic prosperity of any community, never mind the region as a whole. The point, and this, of course, these are figures that were developed before the hydrogen hub had lost a third of its projects. Anton, if we could go to the next slide. However, there is one lurking risk out there. When I described the hydrogen hub a moment ago, I explained that it would be a pretty small affair, both environmentally and economically. There is one possible development that could change that, and that would be especially frightening. And that is if hydrogen and its sister technology, carbon capture and sequestration, which Randy talked a little bit about a moment ago, if those technologies get into the power generating sector. And that's because we have lots of gas-fired power plants in our region. About 60% of all the electricity that we consume comes from gas-fired power plants. And as Randy noted, one of the ideas that's being not just talked about, but is being actively promoted by the Arch2 Hydrogen Hub is the use of hydrogen in power plants. Because those plants are so numerous and the amount of electricity they produce so great, if hydrogen were to get into that sector in any significant way, it would vastly expand both the risks associated with hydrogen, the volume of hydrogen that would be used, and it would also double or triple our electricity bills, because that's how inefficient hydrogen is. And we can talk about that math. If you could go to the next slide. And so the reasons to be very concerned about the hydrogen hub are many. Randy talked about both the climate issues associated with hydrogen and many of the health issues associated with hydrogen. But a lot of times, and especially in our area, we've been pitched on the idea that we should tolerate the kinds of risks that I just talked about because it's important for jobs, it's important for economic growth. And so I just wanted to emphasize that not even that is true in the case of the hydrogen hub. And in fact, it offers significant economic risks, like I said, especially if it gets into the power generating system, where it's hopelessly cost ineffective. And so I wanted to close by just letting folks know that, as I said at the beginning, just because the hub has been announced and hundreds of $1 million have been announced, that doesn't mean it's going to happen or that individual projects will. And that means that there is an immense opening for folks like us who are concerned about this to engage, sometimes oppose, or at the very least modify many of the projects that are being proposed. And there are various places we can do that. Anton has listed the DOE mandated community engagement event that is going to take place on site the week of December 2nd at a location in northeastern Ohio. We don't know yet where that location is, but I'm sure the folks at the Buckeye Environmental Network will keep everybody updated on that. There is also a NEPA process. The National Environmental Policy Act requires that the individual projects that are part of Arch 2 be reviewed for their environmental impacts, and that review process does include community input. Finally, we can also talk to our state and local legislators about what we do and don't want to see in these various programs. And finally, the projects that are part of Arch 2 are themselves required to develop community engagement programs and to issue community benefit statements. That will be yet another opportunity where we can engage on these issues. And then finally, I'll simply close by mentioning that my organization, the Ohio River Valley Institute, has done quite a lot of research both on hydrogen hubs, hydrogen generally, the energy industry, and also the various advocacy opportunities that are out there. So I encourage you to visit the Ohio River Valley Institute.org website, where you can access a variety of resources. And Anton, thank you very much for allowing me to participate today.
Sean, it is such a pleasure to have you. Buckeye Environmental Network encourages you guys to reach out to the county commissioners where hydrogen hubs have been proposed. Ashtabula, Stark County, Pike County, Harrison County. And if you guys know of any that we don't, please pop it in the chat and reach out. I'm going to be providing an additional resources page with the slides to this webinar, to the YouTube link where you can watch this over again, and all of the contact information for you guys to reach out. And when you do, please you can shoot me an email and we can go from there. We'll start organizing in your communities. Follow Buckeye Environmental Network on Facebook and Instagram to stay informed, because we also want to be at the pressure points around the Ohio EPA permitting process for air quality and water quality. So with that, I'm going to start fielding questions. We have 18 minutes. There are no community benefits or community engagement happening despite what they say. Anna Sparks says, how does DOE make decisions on what to fund? They're funding Arch 2 projects to treat fracking waste. And I just heard recently that fracking itself is a justice project, probably environmental justice. Does anybody have any insight on that? How does DOE make decisions on what to fund?
Yeah, I can offer something,
Sure.
Anton. DOE has not announced the selection criteria that it used to select the 7 national hubs, of which Arch 2 is one of those. And moreover, going forward, when I mentioned a moment ago that Arch 2 will be looking for projects to replace the ones that have dropped out, they have also announced that they will not be sharing either with us or, for that matter, with the Department of Energy, the criteria that they're going to use to select those individual projects. And then with respect to the second part of the statement about Justice 40 status, the projects did have to meet a Justice 40 criterion to be selected. However, again, the federal government has not told us what that criterion or those criteria are. So the process is largely opaque to us. And unfortunately, the folks at Arch 2 and DOE have generally not been willing to answer questions, particularly about the individual projects and their impacts.
Thank you, Sean. Dr. Randy, any more on that?
No, that's not in my wheelhouse. Sorry, it's not chemistry related.
No,
I
that
can't
is
predict what they want,
that
really.
is a-okay. Somebody asked, which projects have pulled out? And is it true that some plan to go on without SRVH2's umbrella? Do you mean, oh, Arch 2's umbrella, I'm sure they meant.
The ones that have dropped out, the most noticeable ones in Northeast Ohio, the project that was scheduled for Harrison County, the MPLX, which is the Marathon Oil Project, is one of those that has dropped out. Another major project that has dropped off the radar screen in southern West Virginia is the Adams Fork ammonia plant. And then finally, also in Northeast Ohio, and I'm going to, Anton, can you pull the slide deck back up?
Sure.
And can you go to the slide that has the map of the original Arch 2 projects?
I sure can. Give me 1 second.
Okay. There is another project in Ohio that has dropped out.
It was this one, right? Oops. This one?
Yes, there we are. Yep. The other project that you'll notice in up around Youngstown, there's a project called First Mode. That one has also gone by the wayside. So, and then finally in Ohio, you'll notice down around Marietta, there's a project called TC Camors. That project, as well as its sister project down around Charleston, West Virginia, has also dropped out of the hub. I think that's all 5. Did I get them all?
I think so. I saw Jason Sally's hand up. Jason, if you'd like to unmute, feel free to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I live down here in Southern Ohio, and I'm a part of a consortium of nuclear activists. We are very concerned about the proposed project at the Piketon Atomic Plant Reserve. Trillium and New Point Gas have already purchased the land. It would be a 100-acre facility, but this is a site that is already highly contaminated with radioactive material that will be there forever. Part of their plan is to also sequester, do the carbon sequestering in the bedrock. We also have a very large radioactive dump that's sitting on top of this bedrock that there's also been documentation that is already fractured. So we're concerned that this is just adding to an already ongoing environmental catastrophe in Pike County, but also with the proposed 2 experimental nuclear reactors from Oklo they want to build right next to this hydrogen facility. And you have Centrus with commercial uranium enrichment. To us, this seems like a recipe for a disaster. I mean, you have nuclear and hydrogen together at the same reserve. I just want to kind of get everyone's thoughts on what we should be doing or what information we put out to tell people that this sounds like a really bad idea.
I'll just chime in and say I agree with you. And for that reason, the Trillium project and the associated projects are ones that we're watching, and we're especially concerned that that will be one of the projects that will apply to Arch 2 to be included. Originally, Trillium applied to become to be designated as a hydrogen hub, and it was rejected at the time, although we don't know specifically why DOE rejected it. However, I think it's entirely possible that the folks who are behind that will be soliciting Arch 2 to try to come in, under this new application process that they're creating.
Thank you. Connie, I do see your hand. I want to put your question on hold. If we have time at the end to answer about nuclear power, we will get to it. But I wanted to give somebody else a question, a chance to ask a question about hydrogen if they have it. Anybody have anything? Because I could just go to Connie. All right, Connie, you can go ahead and open this can of worms really quick, but we may have to cut it short if somebody else asks a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to frame this not as a can of worms. I just would like to know whether the speakers or the groups that they represent consider nuclear power to be either renewable or green energy. This sort of ties in with Jason's questions. The Davis-Besse nuclear power plant a number of years ago was proposed as a location for production of hydrogen to use actually nuclear power to presumably to split the water molecule. But without getting into a lot of details, the Ohio House of Representatives has already passed a resolution declaring nuclear power green energy. Next session, it will go before the Senate and will probably pass. So in this state, we will have natural gas considered green energy, and I'm quite sure that nuclear power will also be considered green energy. So I just would like to know where the speakers and their organizations stand on the issue of do they consider nuclear power renewable or green energy?
Thank you, Ms. Klein. Yeah, and I just want to preface for the speakers, if you feel like there's not an adequate amount of time to answer that, I think that just means we're going to have a part 2, and we're going to have to talk about nuclear energy between Orvie, Fecht, and Ben. So I'll preface that for the speakers to give them an out if they choose not to answer.
Well, I personally, I mean, I'm not representing FACT because I'm a volunteer for all the groups that I work with. But it's 69 years old. I was, a little girl when they still did the nuclear, the bomb raids where we had to get underneath our desk in kindergarten and put our hands over our heads in case Russia dropped the nuclear bomb. So I've never been a fan of nuclear energy. And I did many years ago when I was working on my master's degree, got to visit Los Alamos, and that's a visit. It's like, that was during an era when the bomb and they worshipped nuclear everything. And, Bob references everywhere, cameras everywhere. And this was back in the 90s. Just because it's a small nuclear reactor does not mean it's dangerous, in my opinion. And I just think that, you can't insure nuclear facilities and nobody wants them in their backyard. So what, and to call it green energy to me is just complete ridiculousness on the part of Ohio's legislature, and that's where I stand personally. But I've never been.
Thank you, Dr. Randy. Yeah, let's cut that one short. We're going to pick it up in a new webinar because we have a couple other questions that are coming through the chat. Sorry, Sean, you're going to have to wait till our next webinar. I wanted to field the question. Do you have a plan for how to approach the community benefits agreement? I'm from Houston, and they seem to be steamrolling the entire process. Curious to know how you are all addressing community benefits agreements. Sean, do you have anything for that?
Yes, and what I'm going to do is take a little bit of the cowardly way out. I'm going to suggest that you get in touch, or I can do it for you, with a guy by the name of Tom Torres at the Ohio River Valley Institute. We have been coordinating community engagement on community benefit issues with ARCH2 and with the Department of Energy. Very little has taken place so far, none of it coming directly from the ARCH2 projects. But there is a very large group of people that meets, I think, weekly on Thursday mornings, generally speaking, to discuss exactly this issue and to help organize people, just as I know, Anton, you're planning to organize people around that upcoming event in Northeastern Ohio. And Anton, while I've got the microphone, I want to say one other thing, not on nuclear.
Go for it. Go for it.
I just wanted to suggest, if we can capture, because we may not get to all of the questions, if questions go unanswered and we can capture them, I will be happy to deal with them through email, whether through you, Anton, or directly.
Sure, that sounds great. That sounds great, Sean. Let's go really quick to see carbon capture. What are the fears with carbon dioxide sequestration? My fear is that it would leak and stay close to the ground and asphyxiate people. Is that it? Or is expense the main issue? Answer that on carbon capture, and then we're going to get to Kat right after that.
I already kind of answered that. I'm trying to type and I can't see through my bifocals here. But I think the cost, you know, is one issue, but really it's the environmental issues, the fact that, you know, if you look up some of the peer-reviewed studies on carbon capture, it requires a lot of energy and it also requires a lot of water. And if you live in Southeast Ohio right now, water is something that is hard to find. And it's just going to be another place, in addition to the billions of gallons of water that are used for fracking, that we're going to be using water for the carbon capture as well. And you know, people have hit these lines. I mean, they're trying to bury it and sequester it in farms. I know they have landmen approaching people in Carroll, Harrison, and Jefferson County to put you know, carbon underneath, the carbon dioxide underneath their farm fields. And you know, can you imagine if there was a problem and a line broke and you had your cows out there and they all died, or your family died, or the farmhouse died? And there's, you know, legal issues. You know, if the pipeline goes across multiple farms, if somebody gets killed, who's liable for that? You know, if the pipe breaks on one farm and it kills somebody in the next door neighbor's farm, or hurts their cows. A lot of issues.
And I'll just chime in from an economic perspective. What you have to know about carbon capture and sequestration is, if it gets into the energy system, carbon capture basically doubles the cost of creating electricity in natural gas plants, and it triples the cost of electricity from coal plants at a time when renewable resources can do it at no cost increase whatsoever and do a better job of cleaning up.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Dr. Randy, for those. Kat, you may be our last question of the night. Let's see how quick we can go through it. Go for it.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Really appreciate the presentation. I'm really curious about, I didn't realize yet that Marathon MPX, Marathon's pipeline outfit, had pulled out of the ARCH2 project. That is really interesting to me. They also pulled out a huge funding in the Prairie Horizon project too. Marathon is the largest oil manufacturer in the country, and their corporate headquarters are in Ohio. And I'm curious, I think I can understand why they pulled out, but with these little projects everywhere that might pop up, I wonder if anybody knows what might pull them back in, or what they're waiting for if they do get pulled back in.
I'll volunteer one thing that could make a significant difference. And that is, right now, we are waiting, the world is waiting for the Internal Revenue Service, the Department of Treasury, to announce how it is going to interpret a tax credit. It's 45V, which is the tax credit for clean hydrogen, which offers different levels of subsidy depending on how clean, and I use that term advisedly, but how clean your hydrogen is. They are being heavily lobbied by industry right now to loosen the requirements for the highest level of subsidy, which is $3 per kilogram of hydrogen. And if the industry gets much of or the entirety of what it's asking for. And they find that the kind of hydrogen Dr. Randy was talking about, blue hydrogen, which is produced in methane, it is possible that some or all of that hydrogen, the subsidy for that hydrogen, could jump from roughly 60 to 75 cents per kilogram to as much as $3 per kilogram. And if that were to happen, then that project and other projects might jump back in.
Thanks, Sean. At that, we are going to go ahead and wrap it up. You're going to get an email of additional resources, which is going to have the YouTube link for this webinar and also 2 previous webinars. You're going to get the slides, and you're going to get a couple fact sheets from Dr. Randy. And Sean, if you have anything you want me to include, additional readings, I'm happy to include that too. So please, everybody, give a round of applause for our presenters. Thank you so much for being here. This is another one for the books. So thanks, everyone, and we're going to sign off. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
Great job.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye, Carolyn. It was so great to have you on. Thanks for joining.
Great to be here, Anton. Thank you so much for bringing this to all of us.
All right.